Hey everyone, welcome back. Go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, and just let everything from the day melt away. Tonight, we're not going to be visiting any gilded palaces or gossiping about dysfunctional royal families. No, we're heading somewhere much colder, much wetter, and infinitely more miserable. We're traveling back in time to the northern edge of the known world, at least according to the Romans. We're going to spend some time with the guys whose job it was to stand there and stare into the misty, hostile forests of Germania and Britannia. We're talking about the Roman Legionaries, the ones who drew the short straw and got stationed on the absolute fringe of the empire. Think of it as the ancient world's equivalent of being sent to a remote Arctic research station, but with more pointy sticks and less reliable heating. So find a good spot, pull up the covers, and let's just float back to the world of muddy boots, woolen cloaks, and the endless, dreary rain of the northern frontier. Let the story of these grumbling, hard-bitten soldiers gently guide you towards sleep. Our story begins not on the frontier itself, but with the man who would eventually become a legionary. Let's call him Gaius. Gaius isn't some chiseled hero from a movie poster. He's probably a 17-year-old farm boy from rural Italy or Spain, whose prospects at home were, let's say, limited. His family's plot of land is just a bit too small to support him and his 4 brothers. The most exciting thing that happens in his village is when a neighbor's goat gets loose. So one day, a recruiting officer rolls into town, looking sharp in his polished armor, talking up the glory of the legions. He speaks of adventure, of steady pay, of honor for the emperor. He talks about a guaranteed pension after 25 years of service, a plot of land to call your own. To a boy like Gaius, who has never been more than 10 miles from his home, this sounds like a pretty good deal. He conveniently leaves out the parts about dysentery, frostbite, and the high probability of meeting a rather unpleasant end at the hands of a painted man with an axe. But details. Gaius signs up. He says his goodbyes, which are probably pretty brief, because this is the ancient world, and overt displays of emotion are generally frowned upon. And just like that, he's a tiro, a fresh recruit, the lowest of the low. His life is about to change, and not necessarily for the better. The first thing he discovers is that the Roman army is less about glorious battle and more about walking. Lots and lots of walking. He and 100 other new recruits are marched to the nearest training camp. And this is where the systematic breaking down of the individual begins. The Romans were masters of turning soft farm boys into disciplined, unthinking parts of a larger military machine. The training was brutal, repetitive, and designed to weed out anyone who wasn't up to the task. The centurions, the hardened, non-commissioned officers of the legions, were in charge of this process. These were not friendly, encouraging mentors. Think of the meanest gym teacher you ever had. Give him a vine staff for corporal punishment and the legal authority to use it. That's a centurion. The first order of business was physical fitness. The recruits were forced to march. Not a gentle stroll, but a relentless, grueling pace. 20 miles in 5 hours was the standard, in full kit. And the Roman legionaries' kit was substantial. Let's talk about the gear they had to carry. It was lovingly nicknamed Marius Mules. because each soldier was basically a pack animal. First, you have the armor, the famous lorica segmentata, those overlapping plates of iron. It looks impressive, but it was heavy, probably around 20 pounds, and notoriously uncomfortable. It chafed, it pinched, and in the damp northern climate, it was a constant battle against rust. Every single night, you'd have to take it apart, clean it, oil it, and put it all back together. It was held together with leather straps, which, in the endless reign of Britannia, would stretch, rot, and break at the most inconvenient times. Then there's the helmet, the galea. It offered great protection, but severely limited your peripheral vision and hearing. You'd essentially be looking at the world through a metal slit, with the sounds of your own breathing and the clanking of your gear filling your ears. On your left arm, you'd carry the scutum, the iconic curved shield. It was huge, made of layers of wood glued together, covered in leather and edged with iron. It weighed over 20 pounds and was a weapon in its own right. But carrying it for hours on end was an exercise in pure misery for your arm and shoulder. Strapped to your belt, you'd have your primary weapon, the gladius, a short, brutally effective stabbing sword. You'd also have a dagger, the pugio, just in case. But that's just the combat gear. The real fun is the personal equipment. Each legionary carried a pack containing everything he needed to survive. This included a sarcina, a leather satchel holding his rations for several days, usually hardtack biscuit, bacon, and sour wine. He'd have a cooking pot, a drinking cup, a change of woolen tunic, and a heavy cloak called a sagum. This cloak was his blanket, his raincoat, and his pillow. It was probably greasy, smelly, and perpetually damp. But wait, there's more. Because the legionaries were not just soldiers, they were also engineers and construction workers. So each man also had to carry his own tools, a shovel, a pickaxe, a turf cutter, sometimes even a saw, and 2 heavy wooden stakes. These weren't for vampires, they were for building the marching camp every single night. We'll get to that particular joy later. All told, a legionary on the march could be carrying anywhere from 60 to 100 pounds of equipment, and they had to march 20 miles a day in hobnailed sandals called caligae. These were basically leather nets strapped to a thick sole, studded with iron nails for traction. They offered 0 ankle support and were terrible in the cold and wet. Imagine hiking through a muddy Scottish bog in a pair of sandals while carrying 100 pounds. That was a good day in the Roman army. So our boy Gaius spends months doing this, marching, running, jumping, and swimming, all in full armor. He's learning to use his weapons. The gladius wasn't for fancy sword fighting. It was for stabbing. The training was simple and brutal. Shield up, take a step, punch with the shield boss, and thrust the sword into the dummy's gut. Over and over and over again. He learned to throw the pilum, the heavy Roman javelin. It was designed to be thrown once, just before impact, to disrupt the enemy's charge. It had a long iron shank with a soft metal point designed to bend on impact, making it impossible for the enemy to pull it out of their shield and throw it back. A clever design, but it meant you had one shot, no pressure. He learned formations. The Legion was a marvel of organization. It could form a solid wall of shields, the testudo or tortoise formation to protect against arrows, or a dozen other complex maneuvers. This required absolute, unquestioning discipline. A centurion would drill them relentlessly under the hot Italian sun until they could perform these maneuvers in their sleep. Any mistake was met with a swift reminder from the vine staff. It wasn't about teaching. It was about conditioning. It was about erasing the individual and creating a single, cohesive unit that moved and fought as one. Gaius would have been miserable. He'd be exhausted, sore, and probably homesick. He would watch as other recruits washed out, either through injury or because they simply couldn't take it. But if he survived, if he pushed through the pain and the monotony, he would emerge from training as a legionary. He would swear a sacred oath, the sacramentum, pledging his life to the emperor and to Rome. He would be given his official military diploma, a small bronze tablet proving his status. He was no longer a farm boy. He was a soldier of the most powerful army in the world. And as a reward for all his hard work, he would receive his first assignment, a 20-year posting to a place he probably never even heard of, a cold, miserable, perpetually grey land on the absolute edge of nowhere. Welcome to Britannia. His real education was about to begin. So Gaius has his shiny new diploma and a fresh set of hobnailed sandals. He's officially a legionary. The next phase of his adventure is the journey to his new home. This wasn't a quick flight with in-flight entertainment. This was a soul-crushing trek across half of Europe. The legions moved on foot. The famous Roman roads made this easier, of course. They were marvels of engineering, straight as an arrow, allowing for the rapid deployment of troops across the empire. But even on a perfectly paved road, walking 1,000 miles is still walking 1,000 miles. Gaius would have marched as part of a column, a long snaking river of men and mules, stretching for miles. The days would fall into a monotonous rhythm. Wake up before dawn, force down some hardtack and watered down wine, pack up your gear, march for 5 hours, stop for a brief lunch, march for another 5 hours, and then, just when his legs feel like they're about to fall off, the real work begins, because the Roman army never, ever slept in an unsecured location, not even in friendly territory. Every single night, they built a fully fortified camp from scratch. This wasn't just a few tents in a circle. This was a masterpiece of military engineering, constructed in a matter of hours. The moment the legion halted for the day, the centurions would be barking orders. A detachment of engineers would quickly survey the land, choosing the best possible spot, ideally on high ground with a source of water nearby. They would lay out the camp's dimensions with flags and measuring rods. A perfect rectangle every time. Then the legionaries would get to work. Remember those tools Gaius was forced to carry. This is where they came in. Half the men would stand guard, shields locked, facing outward, just in case any locals decided to get ambitious. The other half would start digging. They would dig a ditch, the fossa, around the entire perimeter of the camp. This ditch was typically about 9 feet wide and 7 feet deep. All the earth they dug up was thrown inward to create a rampart, a raised wall of earth. And on top of that rampart, they would plant those heavy wooden stakes they'd been carrying all day, lashing them together to create a sharp, pointed palisade. Inside this defensive perimeter, the camp was laid out in a precise grid pattern. The commander's tent, the praetorium, was always in the center. The tents for the legionaries were arranged in neat rows, with streets running between them. Each 8-man squad, a contubernium, shared a single leather tent. These guys lived together, marched together, fought together, and slept together in a space that was probably uncomfortably cozy. It built camaraderie, sure, but it also meant there was no escaping that one guy who snored. All of this, the ditch, the rampart, the palisade, the entire internal layout, was constructed in about 3 to 4 hours, every single day, after marching 20 miles with 100 pounds on your back. It was exhausting, back-breaking work. There was no option to skip it. It was as much a part of the daily routine as breathing. This discipline is what set the Roman army apart. It was a display of power and organization. They were showing anyone who might be watching that they could literally build a fortress anywhere they pleased, overnight. For Gaius, it was just another chore, another set of aching muscles at the end of a very long day. Finally, after weeks or even months of this, he would arrive at his final destination. Let's say he's assigned to the 9th Legion, stationed in northern Britannia. He marches into the permanent fortress at Eboracum, modern-day York. Or perhaps he's sent even further north to one of the forts along the Great Barrier that would eventually become Hadrian's Wall. The permanent forts were like the marching camps, but on a much grander and more permanent scale. They weren't made of earth and wood. They were built of stone. These fortresses were small cities in their own right. They had stone walls, towers, and heavily fortified gates. Inside, you'd find barracks, a headquarters building, workshops, a granary to store food, and even a hospital, the valetudinarium. For a boy from a small village, a place like this would have been awe-inspiring. It was a slice of Roman order carved into the wild, untamed landscape. But the novelty would wear off pretty quickly, replaced by the crushing routine of garrison life. And then comes the big project. The emperor, in this case Hadrian, has decided that the empire has expanded enough. He wants a clear, permanent border, a line on the map made real. He wants a wall stretching 73 miles from one coast of Britannia to the other. And guess who gets to build it? That's right, Gaius and his friends. The construction of Hadrian's Wall was one of the greatest engineering feats of the ancient world, and it was done almost entirely by the soldiers themselves. The Legionaries were the construction crew. For years, their primary job wasn't fighting. It was quarrying stone, mixing mortar, and laying foundations. It was manual labor on a colossal scale. Imagine the scene. Thousands of legionaries spread out across the rolling, windswept hills of northern England. The sky is a perpetual shade of grey. A cold, drizzling rain is falling, as it almost always is. The men are quarrying stone from the nearby hillsides, cutting massive blocks and hauling them on carts to the construction site. Others are digging the foundations, a massive trench that had to be perfectly level. Then came the masons, carefully laying the stone courses, while others mixed the lime mortar in huge pits. It was slow, tedious, and physically demanding work. The wall itself was a monumental undertaking, about 10 feet wide and perhaps 15 feet high in most places. But that was just the start. In front of the wall, to the north, they dug another massive ditch, the berm, and behind the wall, they built a military road to allow troops to move quickly along its length. And every Roman mile, which is slightly shorter than a modern mile, they built a small fort, a mile castle, which acted as a fortified gateway. And between each pair of mile castles, they built 2 smaller watchtowers or turrets. It was a system of total surveillance and control, but for the men building it, it was just endless repetition. Cut stone, haul stone, lift stone, set stone. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The glamour of being a soldier of Rome probably felt very far away when you were knee-deep in mud, trying to lever a half-ton block of sandstone into place with nothing but muscle and primitive cranes. The centurions would be there, of course, overseeing the work, their vine staffs never far from hand. The standards were exacting. The Romans didn't do shoddy work. This wall was being built to last for centuries, a permanent testament to Roman power. For Gaius, it was just a permanent testament to his aching back. He wasn't building an empire. He was just building a very, very long wall. And he probably wondered, more than once, what on earth the point of it all was. Staring out into the mist, at the endless expanse of hostile barbarian territory, he was about to find out. So the wall is built, or at least a section of it is. The Legionaries can now move into their new permanent homes. These forts, dotted along the wall, were marvels of efficiency and discomfort. The barracks were long, narrow buildings, divided into 10 small rooms. Each room housed an 8-man contubernium. The space was cramped. The men slept on simple wooden bunks. There was a small hearth for cooking and a little bit of warmth. But these rooms would have been dark, smoky, and crowded. This was home for the next 20-odd years. With the major construction done, life for Gaius settles into a new kind of monotony, the daily grind of garrison duty. A huge part of this daily grind revolved around food. The Roman army understood a fundamental truth. An army marches on its stomach. Keeping tens of thousands of soldiers fed on the remote fringes of the empire was a logistical masterpiece. But just because the logistics were impressive doesn't mean the food was good. Once they had their flour, they had a few options. They could mix it with water and a bit of salt to make a simple, unleavened bread. A hardtack biscuit that was tough, bland, and probably required a good long soak in water or wine before you could chew it without breaking a tooth. Or they could make porridge, a thick, grey, lumpy gruel. This was the staple. This was the fuel that kept the empire running. It wasn't exciting, but it was calories. To supplement this festival of carbohydrates, they received rations of other items. The most important was sour wine, or posca. This wasn't the fine Falernian wine the elites were drinking back in Rome. This was cheap, low-quality wine, often watered down and mixed with vinegar. It sounds disgusting, but it was actually quite practical. The vinegar acted as a mild disinfectant, killing some of the bacteria in questionable water sources. It was also a source of vitamin C, which helped ward off scurvy, a constant threat for any large group of people on a limited diet. They also got a ration of salt, which was incredibly important for preserving food and for basic health, and olive oil. The oil was used for cooking, but also for cleaning their bodies and oiling their armor. It was a multi-purpose liquid. And then there was the protein. They'd get rations of bacon or salted pork, which was preserved to last for a long time. Maybe some cheese, if they were lucky. This was the official, state-provided diet. It was designed to be functional, not enjoyable. But legionaries, like all people, sought to improve their lot. The forts often had their own gardens, where soldiers could grow vegetables to supplement their diet. Cabbages, onions, beans, and lentils. They would also hunt and fish. The forests of Britannia were full of deer and wild boar, and the rivers had salmon and trout. For a farm boy like Gaius, hunting would have been a familiar skill and a welcome break from the routine. A successful hunt meant fresh meat roasting over the fire, a rare and cherished luxury. Archaeological digs at forts like Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall have unearthed incredible evidence of what these soldiers were really eating. They found remnants of oysters, imported all the way from the coast. They found chicken bones, the remains of hares, and even the shells of edible dormice, which were considered a delicacy. They also imported spices, peppercorns from India, and exotic fruits like dates and figs. These weren't standard issue, of course. These were things the soldiers bought themselves from the civilian settlement, the vicus, that inevitably sprang up outside every fort. The soldiers had money, and where there are soldiers with money, there are merchants happy to sell them a taste of home. This brings us to another crucial aspect of daily life: hygiene, or the relative lack thereof. Staying clean in a cold, damp environment without modern plumbing is a challenge. The larger forts had bathhouses, which were a cornerstone of Roman culture. The bathhouse was more than just a place to get clean. It was a social club. It had a series of rooms with different temperatures: a warm room, a hot room, and a cold plunge pool. Soldiers could relax, exercise, gamble, and gossip. It was a vital part of maintaining morale. The cleaning process itself was a bit different from ours. They didn't have soap. Instead, they would cover themselves in oil and then scrape the oil, along with all the dirt and sweat, off their skin using a curved metal tool called a strigil. It was surprisingly effective. The problem was, not every fort was large enough to have a grand bathhouse. Smaller outposts might have had a much more rudimentary setup. And then there were the latrines. The Roman army latrines were communal. They consisted of long wooden or stone benches with a series of holes cut into them, set over a channel of constantly running water that would carry the waste away. There were no stalls, no privacy. You'd be sitting shoulder to shoulder with 20 other guys, conducting your business. It was just another part of the complete lack of personal space that defined a soldier's life. On the plus side, these running water latrines were far more sanitary than the simple pit toilets used by most other cultures at the time. They helped keep the spread of disease in check, which was a constant concern in a crowded fort. Still, life was gritty. The barracks would have been filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, damp wool, cooking smoke, and oil for the lamps and armor. Disease was a constant threat. A simple infection from a cut could be a death sentence. The army had skilled doctors, medici, and surprisingly sophisticated medical tools. But without antibiotics, their options were limited. They were good at setting broken bones, stitching wounds, and even performing amputations. The hospital at a fort was an organized, clean space, but it was also a place of great suffering. For Gaius, staying healthy was a primary concern. It meant being careful, keeping his gear clean, and hoping for the best. It meant eating his bland porridge, drinking his sour wine, and trying to avoid the damp chill that seemed to seep into everything on this remote, rainy edge of the world. With his belly full of porridge and his body reasonably clean, Gaius could turn his attention to his actual job. You might think that being a Roman legionary on a hostile frontier was all about epic battles and heroic last stands. The reality, for the vast majority of the time, was a mind-numbing, soul-crushing boredom. The primary role of the soldiers on Hadrian's wall was not to fight, but to be a presence. They were a heavily armed police force, a customs agency, and a border patrol, all rolled into one. The daily routine was dictated by the trumpet call. The first call would sound before dawn, signaling the start of the day. The men would stumble out of their bunks, get dressed, and prepare for the morning assembly. The centurions would assign the day's duties. A lucky few might get skilled work in the workshops, repairing armor, making pottery, or tanning leather. These were the good jobs. Most, however, were assigned to the endless cycle of guard duty, patrols, and manual labor. Guard duty was the cornerstone of garrison life. Every gateway, every tower, and every stretch of the wall had to be manned 24 hours a day. This meant shifts, long, tedious shifts. Gaius would be assigned a post, perhaps on a turret overlooking the misty northern landscape, and he would stand there for hours. He would watch the rain fall. He would watch the clouds drift by. He would stare into the dense forests, looking for any sign of trouble. Most of the time, there was nothing to see. The barbarian tribes on the other side weren't constantly massing for an attack. They were mostly farmers and herders just trying to get by. But the threat was always there. A low-level hum of anxiety beneath the boredom. A flicker of movement in the trees. A plume of smoke where there shouldn't be one. Gaius would have to be constantly alert. The price of falling asleep on duty was death. Discipline was absolute. The sheer monotony is hard to overstate. Imagine standing in the same spot for 4 hours, in the cold and the rain, with nothing but your own thoughts for company. Your mind would wander. You'd think about home, about the warm sunshine of Spain or Italy. You'd think about the girl you left behind. You'd probably hum a tune, or quietly curse the day you ever met that recruiting officer. Then, your shift would end. You'd be relieved by the next man, and you'd have a few hours off before you had to do it all over again. Then there were the patrols. Every day, squads of soldiers would march out from the mile castles. They would patrol the military road that ran along the south side of the wall, ensuring it was clear. More importantly, they would venture north into barbarian territory. These weren't search and destroy missions. They were reconnaissance patrols. Their job was to see and be seen. They were gathering intelligence, observing the local tribes, noting any unusual activity. They were also projecting power, reminding everyone on both sides of the wall that the Roman army was here, and it was watching. These patrols could be tense. As soon as you left the relative safety of the wall, you were in a different world. The Legionaries were trained to fight as a unit in open battlefields. The forests and bogs of northern Britannia were not open battlefields. They were perfect for ambushes. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every bird call that sounded slightly off, would set your nerves on edge. The soldiers would march in tight formation, shields up, javelins ready. They would move with a cautious, practiced efficiency. Most patrols would encounter nothing more dangerous than a startled deer. But the possibility of an ambush was always there. It was a constant psychological pressure. And of course, there was the endless maintenance. A 73-mile-long stone wall doesn't just maintain itself. The winter frosts would heave the foundations. The constant rain would erode the mortar. The wooden watchtowers needed constant repair. The ditches had to be cleared of silt and weeds. So many of Gaius's days would be spent doing the same kind of manual labor he did when he was building the wall in the first place. It was the ancient equivalent of painting the fourth bridge. As soon as you finished, it was time to start again at the other end. The wall also functioned as a customs and immigration checkpoint. The mile castles had gates that allowed for controlled passage. Local tribesmen who were on friendly terms with Rome could come through to trade at the markets in the Vicus. They would bring cattle, hides, and grain to sell. And in return, they would buy Roman goods, pottery, glass, wine, things they couldn't produce themselves. The soldiers at the gates acted as customs officers, inspecting goods, levying taxes, and generally keeping an eye on who was coming and going. This interaction with the locals was a complicated affair. The Romans saw them as uncivilized barbarians. The locals probably saw the Romans as arrogant, heavily armed occupiers. But they had to coexist. Sometimes this relationship was peaceful, built on trade and mutual benefit. Other times it was fraught with tension, a dispute over a trade deal, a stolen cow, a perceived insult. Any small thing could flare up into violence. And when it did, the army would respond with overwhelming, brutal force to make an example of the troublemakers. It was a delicate and often bloody balance. For Gaius, the locals were a source of both fascination and fear. He would see them at the markets, with their strange clothes, their long hair, and their unintelligible language. They were the other, the reason he was stationed in this miserable place. His interactions with them would be limited, filtered through the lens of a conqueror. He was part of an occupying force, and no amount of peaceful trade could ever fully erase that fact. His job was to watch them, to control them, and if necessary, to kill them. It was a simple, brutal equation that defined his existence on the edge of the empire. Life on the frontier wasn't all guard duty and ditch digging. The Roman command understood, at least on a practical level, that you couldn't work soldiers to the bone every single day without a serious decline in morale. There had to be some downtime, some release from the crushing pressure and monotony of their duties. So what did a legionary like Gaius do when he wasn't on patrol or patching up the wall? The most common pastime was, unsurprisingly, gambling. Soldiers have always been gamblers, and the Romans were no exception. They would gamble on anything and everything. The most popular game was dice. Archaeologists have found dice in forts all across the empire, made from bone, wood, or ivory. They weren't always perfectly made either. Some were clearly loaded. Cheating was probably rampant, and dice games often led to arguments, brawls, and soldiers losing an entire month's pay in a single evening. The centurions officially discouraged it, but they knew it was impossible to stop. It was one of the few forms of excitement available. Board games were also incredibly popular. They played games like La Trunku, Huli, which was a game of military strategy, something akin to chess or checkers. They also played tabula, a predecessor to backgammon. Gaming boards were often scratched into flagstones or wooden tables, a permanent invitation for a quick game. These games were a way to pass the long, dark hours of the British winter, a mental challenge to offset the physical drudgery of their lives. And then there was drinking. The daily ration of sour wine, the posca, was just for sustenance. In their off-duty hours, soldiers who had the coin would head to the vicus, the civilian settlement outside the fort. The vicus was a hive of activity. It was home to merchants, craftsmen, and the unofficial families of the soldiers. Roman soldiers were not legally allowed to marry while in service, but that didn't stop them from forming long-term relationships with local women. These unions were common, and the army turned a blind eye. The vicus was where the soldiers' real lives often happened. Here, you would find taverns or popinae, where a legionary could buy better quality wine, imported from Gaul or even Italy. Or he could try the local brew, a thick, cloudy beer made from barley or wheat. For a boy from a wine-drinking Mediterranean culture, British beer would have been an acquired taste. These taverns were noisy, smoky places, filled with soldiers from different corners of the empire, all trying to forget where they were for a little while. They would trade stories, complain about their centurions, and get into drunken arguments, just like soldiers in any army, in any era. Religion also played a huge role in a soldier's life. The Roman state had its official gods, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, and the legion had its own official ceremonies. The legion standards, the eagle and the various other banners, were kept in a shrine in the headquarters building and were treated as sacred objects. Losing a standard in battle was the ultimate disgrace. There were regular ceremonies to honor the gods and, most importantly, the emperor, who was considered a living god. Participation in these state cults was mandatory. It was a test of loyalty. But alongside the official religion, soldiers worshipped a whole host of other gods. The empire was a melting pot of cultures, and the army was its most diverse institution. A soldier from Syria might worship Baal. A soldier from Egypt might carry an amulet of Isis. And on the northern frontier, a strange and popular cult took hold: Mithraism. Mithraism was a mystery religion, popular almost exclusively among soldiers. Its origins were Persian, and it centered on the worship of the god Mithras, who was often depicted slaying a sacred bull. Its rituals were secret, open only to initiates, and they took place in underground temples called Mithraea. Archaeologists have found these temples near forts along Hadrian's wall. They were small, dark, cave-like structures, with benches along the sides and an altar at one end. Here, in the flickering lamplight, soldiers would share a ritual meal and participate in ceremonies that promised salvation and camaraderie. For men living a hard, dangerous life far from home, the appeal of a cult like this is easy to understand. It offered a sense of brotherhood, a shared secret, and a promise of a better life after death. It was a personal faith, something that belonged to them, separate from the rigid, impersonal religion of the state. It was another coping mechanism, another way to find meaning in a life that was often short on it. And of course, there was literacy. We tend to think of the ancient world as largely illiterate, but the Roman army had a surprisingly high rate of literacy. An enormous amount of administration was required to keep the army running, and that meant paperwork. Reports had to be written, supply lists maintained, and letters sent. Soldiers who could read and write had a chance at getting a better job, perhaps as a clerk in the commander's office, a welcome escape from manual labor. The most famous evidence of this comes from the Vindolanda tablets. These are hundreds of thin, postcard-sized wooden tablets containing letters and documents written by the soldiers and their families at the fort of Vindolanda. They were preserved in the damp, oxygen-free soil. They are a breathtakingly intimate snapshot of daily life. There are official military reports, but there are also personal letters. A soldier writes home to his family, asking them to send him warmer socks. The wife of the fort's commander sends a birthday invitation to her sister. One soldier complains to another about the quality of the beer. These letters transform the legionaries from anonymous figures in armor into real, relatable people. They had the same worries, the same complaints, and the same small joys as we do. They worried about their families. They missed home. They complained about their jobs. Gaius would have written letters home, entrusting them to the imperial post service, waiting months for a reply. He would read and reread letters from his family, the thin pieces of wood, a fragile link to the world he had left behind. It was these small human things, a game of dice, a shared drink, a letter from home, a quiet prayer in a dark temple, that allowed him to endure the vast, lonely emptiness of the frontier. So Gaius has his routine. He stands guard, he patrols, he gambles, he writes letters. He has carved out a life of sorts on this remote edge of the world. But looming over everything, both literally and figuratively, was the other. The people on the far side of the wall, the barbarians. What did a Roman legionary actually think about the people he was stationed to watch. The official line from Rome was simple. They were savages, uncivilized, chaotic, and dangerous. Roman writers like Tacitus wrote about them with a mixture of fear and fascination, describing them as noble savages at times, but ultimately as a threat to the ordered, superior world of Rome. This was the propaganda that Gaius would have absorbed, but the daily reality was more complicated. He would see them at the markets, trading peacefully. He might even have a local girlfriend in the Vicus. He would learn that they weren't a monolithic horde of screaming warriors. They were a collection of different tribes, with their own rivalries, their own politics, and their own cultures. They were farmers, not monsters. Yet, the threat of violence was always there. The style of warfare was completely different. The Roman legion was a machine, designed for pitched battles on open ground. They fought as a unit, shield to shield, with disciplined ranks. The tribes of northern Britannia and Germania fought a different kind of war. They excelled at guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids, hit-and-run attacks. They used the terrain, the forests, the hills, the bogs, to their advantage. They would strike quickly and then melt back into the landscape. This was psychologically terrifying for the legionaries. On an open battlefield, you could see your enemy. You knew the rules. But in the dense fog of a Caledonian forest, the enemy could be anywhere. Every shadow could hide a warrior. This created a constant, low-level paranoia. The patrols that ventured north of the wall were not just physically taxing, they were mentally draining. And sometimes the raids did come. Not massive invasions for the most part, but small-scale attacks. A few dozen warriors might try to rush a mile castle gate at night or ambush a supply convoy. The fighting would be fast, brutal, and personal. It wouldn't be the clean, orderly combat of the training ground. It would be a chaotic swirl of spears, axes, and swords. This was the moment all the training was for. This was when the discipline had to hold. But these moments of intense action were rare. For most of Gaius's 25-year service, he might never participate in a major battle. The real enemy was not the barbarian with the axe. The real enemy was the one inside his own head. It was the isolation, the loneliness, the feeling of being forgotten. Thousands of miles from the sun and warmth of home. The winters were especially hard. The days were short, dark and cold. The world was reduced to the grey stone of the fort and the grey sky above. This psychological toll is hard to measure, but it must have been immense. We see hints of it in the Vindolanda tablets. Soldiers talk of being lonely. They beg for news from home. They try to maintain connections to a world that feels increasingly distant. The camaraderie of the Contubernium, the 8-man tent group, was vital. These men became a surrogate family. They relied on each other for survival, not just in a fight, but against the crushing weight of their environment. They would have shared stories, told jokes, and supported each other through the long, dark nights. The landscape itself was an antagonist. It was alien to a man like Gaius, who grew up in the sunny, rolling hills of Italy. The sheer emptiness of the northern fells, the constant wind, the relentless rain. It was a hostile world. The Romans tried to impose their own order on it. They built their straight roads, their perfectly rectangular forts, their massive, uncompromising wall. They were drawing a line and saying, "Here, civilization ends. Beyond is chaos." But they could never truly tame the land or the weather. They were guests here, and the land never let them forget it. And what of the dream that got Gaius to sign up in the first place? The promise of glory and adventure. The reality was anything but glorious. It was a life of routine, of discomfort, of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. The honor of serving the emperor felt very abstract when you were shivering on a watchtower in the middle of a sleet storm. As the years turned into decades, Gaius would change. The soft farm boy would be gone, replaced by a hardened veteran. He would have scars, both physical and mental. He would speak a strange mix of Latin and local Celtic words. He would be an expert on the local climate and the best places to fish. This cold, grey land, which he once hated, would have become his home in a way. The only home he had known for his entire adult life. And finally, after 25 long years, his service would be over. He would be in his 40s, an old man by Roman standards. He would receive his honorable discharge. He would be given his pension, a plot of good farmland, perhaps in a newly colonized part of Britannia, or a lump sum of cash. He was now a veteran, a veteranus, a respected figure. He was free. But what would he do with that freedom? Would he try to go back home, to the village he left as a boy? He would be a stranger there. The world he knew would be gone. His parents would likely be dead, his friends old or moved away. Or would he stay in Britannia? He might have a local wife and children in the Vicus. His whole life was here now. Many veterans chose to stay, settling in the towns that grew up around the forts. They became farmers, merchants, pillars of the new Romano-British community. They had spent their lives defending the frontier, and in the end, the frontier became their home. Our Gaius, now a man with grey in his hair and a permanent ache in his joints from the damp, might buy a small farm within sight of the wall he spent so many years building and guarding. He would live out his days there, watching the seasons change, telling stories to his grandchildren about his time in the legions, stories that probably left out the worst of the boredom, the misery, and the fear. He had survived. He had endured the cold, the rain, and the loneliness. He had stood on the edge of the empire, and he had held the line. And now, at long last, he could rest. And with that, our Legionary's watch has ended. Let's leave him there, in the quiet of his new life, under the same grey sky that has watched over him for so long. Let the story of his long, hard journey fade into the background. Let the sounds of the wind on the fells and the distant call of the trumpet become just a gentle hum. There is no more marching to be done, no more walls to be built, just rest. I hope this story has helped you relax and unwind. I'll be back again soon with another tale. Until then, sleep well.